New York City is a gigantic sprawling place with people in just about every corner of the area. There aren't too many rural or non-crowded areas, so when you find places that seem untouched for years, it comes as a bit of a shock. I am writing this story down for the first time to share my experience. My friends and I were pretty good kids for the most part, at least that was my perspective. We didn't really get into too much trouble, probably due to the fact of what we thought our parents might do if we did get in trouble. Over the summer before many of us were going to be heading all over the country for college, we decided to spend as much time as we could together. One of our hobbies that summer was to explore the nooks and crannies of the city and take loads of photos. We would find and explore all sorts of buildings that were abandoned, old tunnels, and rundown houses. Well, on this specific summer night, we met up as we usually did and found this old building in a lesser populated area. At first, it was no different than any other building we had found in the past. The inside was completely decrepit and filled with trash. It was always nice to try and imagine how the building would look before they were completely condemned or abandoned. We would usually try and research the location after we took pictures and kind of do a before and after. We took a couple of dozen photos and then noticed something strange on the far side on the main floor. There was an old tipped-over bookcase, but the style of the bookcase did not match anything else in the building. It was almost as if the bookcase was too new for the space. Just out of curiosity, I lifted up the bookcase, and there was a trap door underneath the banged-up piece of furniture. After very little deliberation, we decided to open up the trap door and explore underneath the building. It was a small ladder that led to an even smaller landing. From the small landing, there was a staircase that led down to a dark room. The only light was the illumination of the trap door we had left open. We did have some flashlights, and once we reached the bottom, we all turned on our lights and looked for a switch. It did not take long for us to locate the switch, and to our surprise, it had power. Similar to what you would see in a warehouse, we flipped the switch. One by one, each light turned on to shed light on a massive underground room of some kind. The room was largely empty for the most part except for two things. Several feet from the bottom of the stairs was a desk with pens, but that was it, no paper, books, or anything else. Located all the way at the very end of the room, completely adjacent from the stairs, was a vault of some kind. Incredibly curious, we decided to check out the vault to see if it was open or if it was just a large door of some sort. Just to give you an idea of the scope of this room, the vault was probably close to 20 yards from the staircase. When we got to the vault, it was obviously sealed shut. At first, we just took a bunch of pictures, then we started to bang on the vault and try to open it. That's when we froze in fear. We heard something bang back on the vault. Scared out of our minds, we started to bang frantically on the vault door, and the banging from the other side got more intense as well. We thought maybe it was some kind of echo or something like that. But this theory went out the window when we started to hear other noises coming from the vault. It sounded like a siren or maybe even screams. We weren't sure, but decided to sprint out of this building both in shock and fear. Once outside of the building, we made sure to get away as soon as we could in case we did set an alarm off. From what we understand, the police did show up, but found nothing in relation to the vault. Apparently, we were the only ones who were potentially breaking the law. A few weeks later, against our better judgment, we decided to go back to the vault. We carefully made our way to the open room, but to our surprise, the vault was now open. I admit, we were intrigued as well as scared, but decided to look inside anyway. It was a huge vault. Inside were empty crates that looked like they were made of damp wood. Blankets filled most of the floor, and lots of paper plates that had food scraps on them covered the remaining floor opening. The space inside the vault was big enough for several adults to fit in comfortably. We took some photos and left. The place was just too creepy for us to want to spend any more time inside. After that night, we started coming up with all sorts of theories. Was someone living/squatting there? How was this vault door closed the last time we were there? Was someone trapped inside? The next summer, when all of us were home from college, we decided to go back one more time, but were stunned when we arrived at the building. The building had burned down, and nothing was left but rubble. We tried to locate the whereabouts of where the trap door would be, but could not locate it through the now wasteland of the debris. We have no idea what we heard that night and still talk about it to this day. We often come to the consensus that we are happy we didn't end up on the other side of the closed vault. Whenever I tell people that I am from New York, they assume New York City, but in fact, there are plenty of other beautiful places in the state to live. I live out of state now, but during the events of this story, I still lived in upstate New York. Anybody who is familiar with upstate knows that there are some absolutely amazing places to hike. About 3 years ago, my friend Summer and I decided to go on a hike. We drove about an hour or so from our hometown and found a nice long trail to explore. What was nice about our hike was that we found a real secluded place and dove almost right into the woods. There were a couple of beat-down houses on the road, but nothing that would have stopped us or made us feel like we were trespassing. Summer was really good at navigating forests, being able to identify poison ivy, and just keeping exceptionally good bearings, which is good because I was absolutely horrible at that kind of stuff. We traversed for about 40 minutes or so off the main road into the woods. It was gorgeous exploring these woods that looked untouched by humans. Then out of nowhere, the most peculiar thing happened. 40 minutes off the main road, in the woods, was a bench. But the bench was completely destroyed and dirty. If I were to sit on the bench, it would probably collapse. We took photos of this strange forgotten bench and continued on our journey. Probably about 50 yards away, we approached a small chain fence that seemed to stretch for a couple of yards. Behind the fence were these small huts. That's really the only way I can describe them. The huts were built with wood, metal, wire fencing, street signs. Pretty much anything you can think of was used for walls for these tiny little buildings. Pretty creeped out at this point, Summer and I approached the small buildings. They were completely taken over by nature, and inside, there was a single chair, some lockers, and tons of decay and debris. We kept walking and eventually approached these two giant black tubes that almost looked like pillars of some kind. Against our better judgment, we kept exploring and asked ourselves the question, what is all of this? The compound, or whatever you want to call it, really opened up after the black tubes. There were now dozens of these small little huts. Our next big moment of disbelief was in the giant pile of debris that sat in the middle of all these huts. There were telephone poles, all smashed up and broken. But on these wooden beams that lay in the dirt, there were light switches and wire. Whatever this creepy place was actually had electricity at one point. The only thing that gave us some peace of mind was that there was no way anybody could have lived here now. It looked like it had been abandoned since the 60s or something. I only say that because there were statues and trash of items that really looked like that style. We started to look a little bit more in depth into some of these small huts. There were statues of Santa Claus everywhere, religious iconography, and fake flowers. At every turn, there was something different and strange. There was a bus that seemed like it was cut in half, and inside was furnished with chairs and lights that were completely covered in moss and vines now. On the far side of the compound was severely overgrown weeds, and parked in the weeds was an old truck. Again, this truck had all sorts of weeds and bushes growing out of the windows and doors. We made our way to what seemed like the end of all this craziness, but then it just got weirder. There were tons of naked mannequins all over the place. They were hanging in trees, in the weeds, half buried in the dirt. They also had no heads, which was deeply unsettling. Coming from the other direction, we saw a somewhat bigger hut than the others. Just to give you a bit of context in case I was not clear, these huts I am describing are maybe big enough for a small child to live in. They were smaller than most cars. But this one was slightly more than double the size, and on the far side of the hut was what appeared to be a hollowed-out oil drum. This small building was filled with tons of religious statues and carnival equipment. Like old circus items. The feeling Summer and I had at this time was that of paranoia and fear. We decided we had seen enough, and it was time to go. As we approached the first set of huts, we heard shuffling coming from within the small compound. We froze completely in our tracks. We were so far off the road and in the middle of the woods, clearly nobody could be here, but we heard the shuffling. This could have easily been a deer or any other number of animals that made these woods their home, but her and I both had this same feeling, a feeling of just darkness and pain. We did not want to wait and see what it was. We decided to move rather quickly and run from this place. We made it back to the car in about 20 minutes, which is half the time it took to get to these huts. We got to the car and were greeted by some cops. The cops told us somebody called in a complaint that some kids were trespassing and up to no good. We explained to them what was in there and even tried to show some pictures, but they were not having it one bit. Basically, they told us to leave immediately if we did not want to get detained, which we both thought was extremely excessive. If anybody out there had ever seen anything like this, any idea what it could be? We thought maybe some kind of home for a circus. Perhaps workers of some kind? The only thing that made it so outlandish was how deep it was into the woods and how far away it was from any kind of town or city. I have never been back, and I have no desire to ever go back. I am writing this in hopes that somebody has stumbled across something similar and may have some additional information. Anybody who has ever camped up in the Adirondack area of upstate New York knows just how breathtaking and beautiful it can be any time of the year. Last year, I stayed with my family in a cabin that rested in the mountains. I had recently split up with my longtime girlfriend, and it seemed like a wonderful place to go to clear my head. At first, my theory was correct. It was therapeutic and beautiful being out in nature, and it was nice spending some time with my family. One of the really nice things about this cabin was that it was truly separated from any other residence. The closest cabin or campsite was probably at least a mile or more away. This meant we had total and complete privacy. Or so we thought. One late afternoon, probably around 5 p.m., we heard some shuffling coming from the front of the cabin. We were sitting on the back porch and heard some movement that sounded like footsteps. A little on edge, my brother and I got up and got ready, just in case we needed to leap into action. All of a sudden, two middle-aged men walked into the back where we were sitting. I asked in a very abrasive and annoyed voice, "Hey, what are you doing? Can I help you with something?" The men just looked and laughed and said in a cheery voice, "Why, hello there, young man. My name is Louis, and this is Tito. We just really wanted to check the view out at this place. We have heard so many wonderful stories." The men seemed sincere, but something just didn't seem right to me. I still looked at them with an uneasy feeling in my stomach, but my mother, who was a very friendly person, made small talk with the man. Perhaps the most unsettling thing of this entire interaction was the friend Tito, who was just standing around looking at the house, with seemingly no facial movements or anything. Louis was charismatic, smiled a lot, and made lots of eye contact, whereas Tito was almost the opposite. After several minutes of small talk, they vanished back into the woods. I was not a fan of this at all, and quickly let my family know about it. Where were these guys coming from, I thought. As I stated previously, the closest place was about a mile or so away, and that place belonged to the guy who owned the cabin we were staying in. So, Louis and Tito must have been hiking for a little while to get to our cabin, which is not unlikely up in the Adirondacks, but something was off about that entire interaction. It bothered me all night. Around 11 p.m., my family went to bed, and I sat around a fire with my brother and his fiancée. Every little noise I heard caused me to jump. My brother told me not to worry about it, and I was just worrying too much over nothing. I pretended everything was okay, but really I was still uneasy about our unwelcome visitors. Shortly after midnight, it was just my brother and I around the fire. We decided to let the last few logs burn out before we went inside. This is when Louis decided to pay us another visit, but this time he was not so friendly. My brother and I jumped out of our chairs and were now facing Louis and Tito, who were coming out of the woods. They looked crazy. Louis did not have that same charming personality as before. His eyes were bulging from his head, and he flashed his pearly white teeth in an almost sadistic way. Tito, who was almost a statue earlier in the day, stood next to Louis, also smiling and slowly approaching me and my brother. Louis started to slowly approach us and said, "This cabin really is lovely. I think we will be staying here now." He reached into his bag as if to pull something out. Tito, who was slightly behind him, was already wielding some sort of bushwhacking sword. Not trying to take any chances as to what Louis was pulling out of the bag, my brother decided to tackle the man. He went down with relative ease. As Tito approached my brother with the sword, I ran over and pushed him, strictly using adrenaline as my motivator. Both men got up and backed away. Louis, now standing about 10 feet away, kept saying, "You have no idea who I am and who you are messing with. I built this house. This is my land." After repeating this a couple of times, Tito finally spoke up as well and said in an almost robotic voice, "We shall have our land back. We must wait for the right time." Tito grabbed the shoulder of Louis, and they both ran into the woods. Remember, this is after midnight in the woods, so it was pitch black, other than a soft orange light from the dying fire. We put the fire out rather quickly and went inside the cabin, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. My brother and I stayed up all night, basically watching the property to make sure they did not return. I have never been so happy to see the sun in my entire life. The next day, we went to see the property owner and told him about the entire night. He said he had never heard the two names before and assured me that no Louis ever built the house. The owner who we were renting the cabin from told us that he built the cabin 10 years ago. So, who were these two that claimed that they built the cabin? The owner was kind enough to refund us the rest of the nights we were supposed to stay at the cabin. I know this could have ended much worse for us, and all things considered, I am very lucky that I left with no more than some minor psychological damage. Be safe, everybody, and always lock your doors. You never know who could be creeping around outside.